Heart-stopping rescue, huge python coils around a pregnant jaguar in the savannah. The sun hung low over the savannah, casting long shadows across the dry grass that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The air was thick with heat, the kind that clung to the skin and made every breath feel heavy. In the distance, a line of acacia trees marked the edge of a riverbed that had mostly dried up during the long, dry season, leaving only scattered pools of murky water where life still clung desperately to survival. Near one of these pools, hidden partially by the tall reeds and the gnarled roots of an old fig tree, a jaguar lay panting in the shade. Her golden coat, dappled with black rosettes, rose and fell with labored breaths. She was heavily pregnant, her belly swollen and low, making even the simplest movements exhausting. Her amber eyes, usually sharp and alert, were half-closed with fatigue. She had come to the water to drink, to find some relief from the oppressive heat, but the effort had drained her. The jaguar's name, if she had one in the language of humans, might have been Amara, a name that meant eternal, enduring, and endure she had. For weeks she had been alone, her mate lost to a territorial fight with a younger male. Now, with her cubs due any day, she was vulnerable in ways she had never been before. Every instinct told her to find shelter, to prepare a den, but her body was too heavy, too slow. She needed rest, she needed water, she needed safety, but the savannah was not a place that granted safety freely. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and stay with us. Coiled in the shadows of the riverbank, camouflaged perfectly against the mottled bark and dried mud, was a python. It was enormous, nearly 5 meters long, its body as thick as a man's thigh. The snake had been there for hours, motionless, waiting. It had sensed the jaguar's approach through the vibrations in the ground, felt the slow, heavy rhythm of her movements. The python was old, experienced, and patient. It knew that pregnant animals were easier prey, slower, less aggressive, distracted by the burden they carried. The snake's cold, unblinking eyes watched as the jaguar lowered her head to drink. The water was stagnant, warm, but it was all she had. She lapped at it weakly, her tongue pink and dry. Her ears flicked back and forth, listening, but exhaustion dulled her senses. She didn't hear the faint rustle of scales sliding over stone. She didn't feel the subtle shift in the air as the python began to move. It happened with terrifying speed. One moment, Amara was drinking, her mind fogged with heat and weariness. The next, a crushing weight slammed into her side, knocking her off balance. She tried to roar, but the sound came out as a strangled gasp as thick coils wrapped around her ribcage, squeezing with relentless force. The python's muscular body moved like liquid iron, looping once, twice, 3 times around her torso and hindquarters. The pressure was immediate and suffocating. Amara thrashed wildly, her claws digging into the earth, her powerful legs kicking. But the more she struggled, the tighter the python squeezed. She could feel her ribs compressing, her lungs unable to expand fully. Panic surged through her, not just for herself, but for the lives growing inside her. She twisted her head, snapping her jaws at the snake's body, but her teeth couldn't find purchase on the thick, muscular coils. The python's head rose near hers, mouth agape, displaying rows of backward-curving teeth, preparing to secure its grip. The jaguar's vision began to blur. Her movements grew weaker. The world narrowed to the crushing pressure and the desperate need for air. A kilometer away, walking along the dusty road that cut through the edge of the savannah, was a man named Daniel Okoro. He was in his mid-40s, with weathered brown skin and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Daniel worked as a ranger for the local conservation reserve, a job that had chosen him as much as he had chosen it. He had grown up in a village nearby, raised by a grandmother who taught him that all life was sacred, that every creature, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, had a place in the balance of the world. Today, he was returning from a routine patrol, checking camera traps and water sources, ensuring that the wildlife under his protection had what they needed to survive. His uniform was dusty, his boots worn, and his backpack heavy with equipment. He was tired, looking forward to a simple meal and a night's rest, but as he walked, something made him pause. It was a sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A low, guttural cry, followed by the thrashing of something large in the underbrush. Daniel's instincts, honed by years in the bush, immediately sharpened. That wasn't the sound of a hunt. It was the sound of a struggle. Something was wrong. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and began moving quickly toward the sound, his heart rate picking up. The path led him off the road, through the dry grass that scratched at his legs, toward the riverbed. He moved carefully but urgently, his eyes scanning for danger. Lions, hyenas, even elephants, any of them could be responsible for what he was hearing. But as he drew closer, as the sounds became clearer, he realized it was something different. When Daniel finally pushed through the last wall of reeds and saw the scene before him, his breath caught in his throat. The jaguar was barely moving now, her body almost entirely encased in the python's coils. Only her head and part of one front leg were free, twitching weakly. The snake's body pulsed with each constriction, methodical and merciless. The jaguar's tongue lolled from her mouth, her eyes rolled back, her belly pressed dangerously tight against the crushing force. Daniel's mind raced. Jaguars weren't native to this part of the savannah. She must have wandered far from her territory, perhaps disoriented by pregnancy and thirst. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was that she was dying. And so were her unborn cubs. Every fiber of his training told him to stay back. Interfering with nature was dangerous, both ethically and physically. The python was just doing what pythons do. The jaguar was prey in this moment, and that was the harsh reality of the wild. But as Daniel looked into the jaguar's fading eyes, as he saw the swollen curve of her belly being compressed by the snake's relentless grip, something deeper than training spoke to him. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind. When you can help, and you choose not to, you become part of the cruelty. Daniel dropped his backpack and began searching through it with shaking hands. He had a machete, standard equipment for clearing brush, but using it risked injuring the jaguar. He had a radio, but help was too far away. He had a flashlight, a first aid kit, a water bottle. None of it seemed enough, but he also had something else, a long, sturdy pole he used for checking burrows and moving obstacles. It wasn't much, but it was something. He took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to whatever forces watched over fools who intervened in nature's business, and stepped forward. The python sensed him immediately, its head swiveled, tongue flicking, assessing this new threat. But it didn't release its grip. It had invested too much energy in this kill. It wasn't about to give up. Daniel moved slowly, speaking in a low, calm voice. Not to the snake, which couldn't understand, but to steady his own nerves. Easy now. Easy. I'm not here to hurt you, but I can't let you do this. He positioned himself carefully, staying out of striking range, and began to probe gently at the coils near the jaguar's hindquarters, trying to create an opening, trying to give her lungs just a moment's relief. The python hissed, a sharp, angry sound, and shifted its weight. For a moment, Daniel thought it might release the jaguar and come for him instead. Part of him almost hoped it would, but the snake held firm. This was going to be harder than he thought. Daniel had faced dangerous situations before. He had been charged by a buffalo, treed by a leopard, and once found himself uncomfortably close to a black mamba that had taken refuge in the reserve's equipment shed. Each time his training had guided him. Stay calm, move slowly, respect the animal's space, and remember that they were not acting out of malice, but instinct. But this was different. This wasn't about protecting himself. This was about saving 2 lives. Perhaps even more, if the cubs inside the jaguar could somehow survive what was happening to their mother. He adjusted his grip on the pole and tried a different approach. this time pushing firmly but carefully against the python's body near its midsection, attempting to disrupt its leverage. The snake's muscles were like steel cables wrapped in leather. It barely registered his effort. The python tightened its grip in response, and Daniel heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A weak, desperate wheeze from the jaguar as what little air remained in her lungs was forced out. "No, no, no," Daniel whispered urgently. He was making it worse. He pulled back, his mind racing. The python wouldn't release unless it felt genuinely threatened, or unless its prey stopped moving entirely and it could begin the long process of swallowing. Neither option was acceptable. The jaguar's body had gone almost still now, only the faintest tremor running through her limbs. Her eyes were glazed, barely conscious. Minutes, maybe only seconds, remained. Daniel made a decision. He dropped the pole and pulled the machete from his belt. His hands were steady now, the initial panic burned away by the urgency of the moment. He had to be precise. One wrong move and he could sever an artery, the jaguar's or his own, if the snake retaliated. He positioned himself at the python's tail end, the safest place to be, away from its head and away from the jaguar's claws. Speaking softly, almost apologetically, he said, "I'm sorry, brother, but I have to do this." The machete blade caught the fading sunlight as he brought it down in a controlled strike against the tip of the python's tail, not cutting, but delivering a sharp, painful blow. The snake recoiled instantly, its entire body jerking in surprise and pain. For just a moment the coils loosened. It was enough. Daniel immediately wedged the pole into the gap he'd created, prying at the coils with all his strength. Come on," he grunted. The python, now fully aware that it was under attack, began to release its grip on the jaguar, its survival instinct overriding its feeding instinct. Its massive head swung toward Daniel, mouth open, hissing with fury. The jaguar, suddenly freed from the crushing pressure, gasped, a horrible rattling sound, and her body convulsed as oxygen rushed back into her starved lungs. She tried to move, to escape, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She collapsed onto her side, ribs heaving, eyes wide with shock and pain. The python, now fully committed to defending itself, began to slide rapidly toward Daniel. 5 meters of angry predator moving with frightening speed across the ground. Daniel backed away quickly, keeping the pole between them, his heart hammering. He didn't want to kill the snake. It was just doing what nature designed it to do, but he wasn't about to let it attack him or return to the jaguar. "Go! Get out of here!" he shouted, waving the pole. The python paused, tongue flicking, assessing. Then, perhaps deciding this prey was too much trouble, it changed direction and slid smoothly into the reeds, disappearing into the dense vegetation along the riverbank. Within seconds it was gone, as if it had never been there. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, breathing hard, machete still gripped in his white-knuckled hand. Then he turned to the jaguar. She was alive, but barely. Her sides rose and fell in rapid, shallow gasps. Blood trickled from her mouth, possibly from internal injuries, possibly just from biting her own tongue during the struggle. Her eyes tracked him weakly, filled not with gratitude, but with fear and pain. She was still a wild animal, and he was still a threat. "It's okay," Daniel said softly, slowly crouching down but keeping a respectful distance. "It's okay, Mama. I'm not going to hurt you." He knew she couldn't understand his words, but tone mattered. Animals recognized calm. They recognized intention, even if they couldn't grasp language. He retrieved his backpack and pulled out the water bottle, pouring some onto his hand and holding it out toward her, though he knew she was too frightened to approach. She needed fluids desperately, but forcing it would only traumatize her further. Instead, Daniel poured water onto the ground near her mouth, creating a small puddle. After a moment, the jaguar's tongue, pink and dry, extended tentatively and lapped at the moisture. She drank weakly, her body still trembling. Daniel sat back on his heels, giving her space, and pulled out his radio. He keyed the transmit button. Base, this is Ranger Okoro. I have a situation at the old riverbed. Coordinates 14 South. I need veterinary support immediately. Over. Static crackled. Then a voice responded. Copy, Daniel. What's the nature of the situation? Over. Jaguar, female, heavily pregnant. She was attacked by a python. Constriction injuries. She's alive but critical. I need Dr. Amare if she's available. Over. There was a pause. Daniel, did you say Jaguar? We don't have Jaguars in this sector. Over. I know what I'm looking at, Base. She's here. Probably displaced. Just send help. Over. Copy. Dr. Amare is 2 hours out. Can you stabilize until then? Over. 2 hours. Daniel looked at the Jaguar, at her labored breathing, at the way her belly contracted irregularly. He wasn't a veterinarian. He had basic wildlife first aid training, but nothing that prepared him for this. I'll do what I can. Okoro out. He set the radio down and looked at the Jaguar, at Amara, though he didn't know her name. He only knew that she was a mother fighting for her life and the lives of her unborn cubs. You picked a hell of a place to have a bad day, he said quietly. Daniel's mind drifted as he watched her, back to the reason he had become a ranger in the first place. It hadn't been a childhood dream or a romantic notion about working with wildlife. It had been born from loss. 20 years ago, when Daniel was in his early 20s, his younger sister Amara, yes, he realized now with a strange chill, the same name he had unconsciously given the Jaguar, had been caught in a flash flood during the rainy season. She had been walking home from school, and the water had risen too quickly. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Daniel had been the one to find her. He had tried everything, CPR, dragging her to higher ground, screaming for help, but there had been no one there, no one to help him help her. He had been alone, powerless, and that feeling had haunted him for years. His grandmother, in her wisdom, had told him something he carried ever since. You couldn't save Amara, but you can save others. That's how we honor those we've lost, by being present for those who still need us. So he became a ranger. He learned to track, to understand animal behavior, to respect the delicate balance of life in the savannah, and on days like today, when he could make a difference, when he could be present for a creature in desperate need, he felt his sister's spirit guiding him. He looked at the Jaguar, at this other Amara, and felt a connection he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was projection, maybe it was grief taking a new shape. Or maybe, in some way the world didn't need to justify. He was being given a second chance. I'm not leaving you, he said firmly. I stayed with my sister until the end. I'll stay with you until help comes. I promise. The Jaguar's amber eyes met his, and for just a moment the fear in them seemed to soften. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the recognition that this strange creature crouching nearby meant her no harm. Daniel began to move slowly, deliberately, setting up a perimeter of sorts. He spread his jacket out to create shade for her head. He poured more water into a depression in the ground within her reach. He used his radio to update base on her condition every 15 minutes, describing her breathing, her alertness, any changes. As the sun sank lower, painting the savannah in golds and deep oranges, the temperature began to drop. The Jaguar's breathing steadied slightly, still labored, still concerning, but no longer the desperate gasping of before. She watched Daniel constantly, her eyes never leaving him, trying to understand what he was. Predator? No, he hadn't attacked when she was helpless. Prey? No, he was too large, too calm, too deliberate. Something else then. Something she had no category for. Daniel spoke to her softly as the light faded. He told her about his work, about the animals he'd helped, about his grandmother and his sister. He told her she was strong, that she would survive, that her cubs deserved to see the world. He didn't know if any of it mattered, but the sound of a calm human voice seemed to ease her tension, if only slightly. An hour passed. Then another. The stars began to emerge, brilliant and countless against the darkening sky. In the distance, Daniel heard the call of a hyena. then another answering it. His hand moved instinctively to the machete. Hyenas had an exceptional sense of smell. They would know there was an injured animal here. And they wouldn't be as easy to scare off as the python had been. He added more deadwood to a small fire he'd built, making it larger, brighter. Fire would keep most predators at bay. Most, but not all. The jaguar shifted slightly, a low groan escaping her throat. Her belly rippled visibly, a contraction. Daniel's heart sank. The stress, the injuries, the constriction, it was triggering early labor. "No, no, not yet," he whispered. "You need help. You need the vet. Just hold on a little longer." But nature didn't wait for convenience. The jaguar's body was making its own decisions now, preparing to bring new life into the world, whether she was ready or not. Daniel grabbed his radio with shaking hands. "Base, this is Okoro. She's going into labor. How far out is Dr. Amare? Over." The response came quickly, but it wasn't what he wanted to hear. "Still 40 minutes out, Daniel. You're going to have to manage on your own until she arrives. Over." Daniel looked at the jaguar, at the pain in her eyes, at the impossible situation unfolding before him. He had saved her from the python, but the night was far from over. Daniel had witnessed births before. Antelope calves taking their first wobbling steps minutes after emerging into the world. Buffalo calves being nudged and licked clean by their mothers. Once, from a respectful distance, he had even watched a lioness deliver a litter of cubs, the process surprisingly quick and efficient, guided by millions of years of instinct. But he had never been this close. Never been the only hope for a mother in distress, and certainly never with a jaguar, a species that shouldn't even exist in this part of Africa, an animal whose presence here was as mysterious as it was miraculous. The contractions were coming more frequently now. The jaguar's body tensed and released in waves, her muscles rippling beneath her golden coat. She panted heavily, her tongue lolling, eyes squeezed shut with pain. Between contractions, she would look at Daniel with an expression that seemed almost pleading, as if asking him to make it stop, to make it easier. "I know, Mama. I know it hurts," Daniel said softly, his voice steady, even though his hands trembled. "But you're strong. You've survived everything the world has thrown at you. You can do this." He had pulled out his first aid kit and was taking inventory of what little he had that might be useful. Sterile gloves, meant for treating human injuries but better than nothing. Clean towels, antiseptic, an emergency thermal blanket, a small flashlight. It was woefully inadequate, but it was all he had. The fire crackled beside them, casting dancing shadows across the scene. Daniel had built it up as large as he dared, creating a barrier of light and heat that would hopefully deter any curious predators. The night sounds of the savannah surrounded them. The distant roar of a lion, the chattering of insects, the rustle of the wind through dry grass. Every sound made Daniel's nerves spike, his awareness stretched thin as he tried to monitor both the jaguar and their surroundings. Another contraction hit, stronger than the others. The jaguar let out a sound Daniel had never heard before, part growl, part cry, wholly filled with pain. Her body arched, her claws digging furrows in the earth. And then Daniel saw it, the first signs that a cub was coming. Okay, he breathed, pulling on the gloves with shaking hands. "This is happening. We're doing this." He had no idea what he was doing. His training had covered basic wildlife first aid, not obstetrics. But he remembered what his grandmother had told him when one of the village goats was having trouble delivering. Sometimes you just need to be there. Sometimes presence is enough. But if you must act, be gentle, be patient, and trust that the mother knows what her body needs to do. The jaguar seemed to sense that something was about to change. Her fear of Daniel was overridden now by something more primal, the need for help, for support, for another living being to bear witness to this moment. She didn't approach him, but she stopped trying to drag herself away. Her eyes locked onto his, and in them Daniel saw a kind of desperate trust. "I've got you," he promised. I'm right here." The minutes that followed were the longest of Daniel's life. The first cub emerged slowly, still encased in its birth sac. The Jaguar immediately twisted her head around, her maternal instincts overriding her exhaustion. She began to lick vigorously, breaking the membrane, clearing the tiny nose and mouth. The cub was impossibly small, wet and dark, its markings not yet visible. For a terrifying moment it didn't move. Then it twitched. A tiny mouth opened, a weak mewling sound emerged. Daniel felt tears spring to his eyes. "That's it, Mama. Good job. You did it." But the Jaguar wasn't finished. Another contraction seized her, and Daniel realized there were more cubs coming. Of course there were. Jaguars typically had litters of 2 to 4. She had barely recovered from delivering the first when the second began to emerge. This one came faster, but something was wrong. The cub was larger than the first, and the Jaguar's exhausted, injured body was struggling. She cried out, thrashing, unable to complete the delivery. The cub was stuck. Daniel's medical training kicked in, limited as it was. He knew that if the cub remained stuck, both it and the mother could die. Infection, hemorrhaging, oxygen deprivation, the risks multiplied with every passing second. "I'm sorry, Mama, I have to help." Moving as slowly and carefully as he could, Daniel positioned himself near her hindquarters. The Jaguar's head swiveled toward him, a warning growl rumbling in her throat despite her pain. Her claws flexed. She could still kill him with one swipe, even in her weakened state. I know you don't want me this close, but your baby needs help. Please, let me help." Perhaps she understood something in his tone. Perhaps she simply had no energy left to fight, or perhaps, on some level that transcended species, she recognized that this strange creature was trying to save her and her cubs. Whatever the reason, she laid her head back down, still watching him, but no longer growling. Daniel's hands moved with careful precision, remembering the few times he'd helped pull a stuck calf or lamb during his childhood on his uncle's farm. He could feel the cub's tiny body, warm and fragile, caught in the birth canal. Gently, so gently, he tried to adjust its position, to help it along the path it needed to travel. "Come on, little one, come on," he whispered. The Jaguar pushed again, her whole body straining, and Daniel supported the cub as it finally, blessedly, slipped free. It was larger than the first, a male, and it came out silent and still, too still. Daniel's heart plummeted. He quickly cleared the membrane from its face, rubbing it with a towel to stimulate breathing, the way he'd seen veterinarians do. Nothing. The tiny chest didn't move. No, you don't get to die. Not after everything. He'd seen rangers perform CPR on newborn antelope once. It had seemed absurd at the time, mouth-to-snout resuscitation on an animal. But desperate times called for desperate measures. He covered the cub's tiny nose and mouth with his own mouth and gave the gentlest breath he could manage, just a puff of air, into those undeveloped lungs. Then he rubbed the cub's chest again, stimulating, hoping. 1 second, 2, 3, a gasp, a cough. The tiny body convulsed, and then the cub was breathing, weak and irregular, but breathing. "Yes, yes!" Daniel laughed, the sound almost manic with relief. He quickly placed the cub near its mother's face, and she immediately began to lick it, her rough tongue cleaning and stimulating, encouraging it to live. But there was no time to celebrate. A third cub was coming. This one emerged more easily, smaller than the other two, a female. She came out wriggling and mewling, full of life and fight. The Jaguar cleaned her with the same vigorous attention, and soon all 3 cubs were nestled against her belly, instinctively seeking the warmth and milk that would keep them alive. Daniel sat back on his heels, exhausted, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cooling night air. His hands were shaking with adrenaline and emotion. 3 cubs, 3 lives that had come so close to never existing, 3 miracles wrapped in wet fur, already competing for position at their mother's teats. The Jaguar looked different now, still exhausted, still in pain, but there was something new in her eyes, a fierce, protective determination. She pulled her cubs closer with one massive paw, surrounding them with her body, and for the first time since Daniel had found her, she didn't look at him with fear. She looked at him with something that might have been gratitude. "You're welcome," Daniel said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He checked his watch. 20 minutes until Dr. Amare arrived. 20 minutes and they'd made it this far. The hardest part was over, or so he thought. The sound came from the darkness beyond the firelight, low, whooping laughter that sent chills down Daniel's spine. Hyenas, and not just one. The unmistakable chorus of a clan, communicating, coordinating. Daniel grabbed his flashlight and swept the beam across the surrounding area. Yellow-green eyes reflected back at him from multiple directions. 4, 5, 6 pairs. More than he could handle alone. Hyenas were opportunistic scavengers, but they were also efficient hunters, especially in groups. They could smell the blood from the birth, smell weakness and vulnerability. An injured jaguar and newborn cubs were exactly the kind of easy meal they specialized in. The jaguar heard them too. She tried to rise, to position herself defensively, but her body wouldn't cooperate. The trauma of the python attack combined with the stress of labor had left her barely able to lift her head. The cubs mewled, sensing their mother's distress, their tiny voices pitifully small against the night. Daniel stood, placing himself between the hyenas and the jaguar. He grabbed a burning branch from the fire, holding it like a torch in one hand, the machete in the other. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice booming with more confidence than he felt. "Get back!" The hyenas circled closer, their bodies low, hackles raised. They were wary of the fire, but hungry and persistent. The largest one, probably the matriarch, let out a series of whoops and giggles, calling the others to advance. Daniel waved the torch, creating arcs of flame in the darkness. The hyenas backed off slightly, but they didn't leave. They were testing him, probing for weakness, waiting for an opportunity. Behind him, Daniel heard a sound that made his blood freeze, a weak, determined growl. He glanced back and saw the jaguar trying to stand, trying to defend her cubs despite her injuries. She made it halfway up before her legs buckled and she collapsed again. The hyenas saw it too, saw the weakness, and they began to close in with renewed confidence. Daniel's radio crackled. "Daniel, this is Dr. Amare. I'm 5 minutes out. What's your status?" "Over." 5 minutes. It might as well have been 5 hours. "We've got hyenas," Daniel said tersely, not taking his eyes off the circling predators. "Multiple. I need you to come in hot with lights and sirens. Make as much noise as possible. Over." "Copy that. Hang tight. We're coming." Hang tight. Easy to say when you weren't standing alone in the dark, protecting a mother and her newborns from a hungry clan of apex scavengers. One of the hyenas darted forward, testing his defenses. Daniel swung the torch and it yelped, retreating, but another immediately moved in from a different angle. They were coordinating, trying to overwhelm him. "I said back!" Daniel roared, his voice hoarse. He thought of his sister. He thought of his grandmother. He thought of every moment that had led him to this point, this impossible, terrifying, beautiful moment where he stood as the only barrier between life and death. He thought of the jaguar behind him, of the 3 tiny cubs nursing at her belly, completely unaware of how fragile their first moments of life were. And he made a promise to the night, to the universe, to whatever force had brought this jaguar to this place at this time. They will not die. Not tonight, not while I still breathe. The hyenas sensed his determination, but they also sensed his isolation. They began to spread out wider, preparing for a coordinated rush. And then, cutting through the darkness like salvation itself, came the sound of an engine roaring, headlights blazing, and a siren wailing across the savannah. Help had arrived. The Land Rover crashed through the underbrush like a charging rhino, its high beams cutting through the darkness and flooding the riverbank with harsh white light. The hyenas scattered immediately, their eyes flashing in the glare as they retreated into the shadows, their whooping calls fading into the distance. They wouldn't go far, Daniel knew that. But for now, the threat was diminished. The vehicle skidded to a stop 20 meters away, and two figures emerged quickly. The first was Dr. Asha Amare, a woman in her late 30s with dark skin, close-cropped hair, and the kind of focused intensity that came from years of emergency veterinary work in the field. She wore cargo pants, a field vest covered in pockets, and carried a large medical kit that looked like it weighed as much as a small child. The second figure was Marcus, a younger ranger Daniel knew from the reserve, broad-shouldered, quick-moving, and reliable in a crisis. He carried a rifle loaded with tranquilizer darts and immediately took up a position watching the perimeter, his eyes scanning for the hyenas that were surely still watching from the darkness. "Daniel!" Dr. Amare called out, already moving toward him with purposeful strides. "Status report. Quickly." Daniel lowered the torch, his arm aching from holding it aloft for so long. His voice came out rougher than he expected. Jaguar, female, heavily pregnant, was pregnant. She gave birth about 30 minutes ago, 3 cubs, all alive. She was attacked by a python before labor, constriction injuries to the torso. I don't know the extent of internal damage. She's weak, barely mobile, but conscious. Dr. Amare's eyebrows rose sharply at the word Jaguar, but she didn't waste time with questions. She dropped to her knees beside the big cat, her movements careful but efficient, already pulling equipment from her kit, a stethoscope, a pen light, syringes, vials of medication. The Jaguar's lips pulled back in a weak snarl as the doctor approached, a warning that still carried weight despite her exhaustion. "Easy, beautiful," Dr. Amare said softly, her voice like honey and steel combined. "I know you don't know me. I know you're afraid. But we're going to help you, I promise." She looked at Daniel. "I need you to keep talking to her. She knows your voice. She trusts you, even if she doesn't realize it yet. Keep her calm while I examine her." Daniel nodded and moved to the Jaguar's head, crouching down at a safe distance, but within her line of sight. "Hey, Mama, remember me? I'm still here. This is Dr. Amare. She's helped hundreds of animals, lions, elephants, everything. She's good at what she does. She's going to make sure you and your babies are okay." The Jaguar's eyes flicked between Daniel and the doctor, her body tense but not aggressive. The 3 cubs continued to nurse, oblivious to the drama surrounding their first hour of life, their tiny paws kneading against their mother's belly. Dr. Amare worked with practiced precision. She listened to the Jaguar's heart and lungs, noting the irregular rhythm and the shallow breathing. She gently palpated the ribs, feeling for breaks or severe bruising, and the Jaguar flinched but didn't strike. She examined the cubs briefly, checking their breathing, their temperature, their latching ability. After 5 minutes that felt like an eternity, she sat back on her heels and looked at Daniel with an expression that was both impressed and concerned. "She has at least 3 cracked ribs, possibly more, severe bruising throughout the thoracic cavity, elevated heart rate consistent with shock and trauma. She's dehydrated and malnourished. She's been struggling for a while, probably before the python attack." Dr. Amare paused, her jaw tightening. "Daniel, the fact that she survived the constriction at all is remarkable. The fact that she delivered 3 healthy cubs after what her body went through. I've never seen anything like it." "Will she make it?" Daniel asked, the question simple but weighted with everything he'd invested in the last few hours. "Doctor." Amare was quiet for a moment, her hand resting gently on the Jaguar's shoulder. "I don't know," she said honestly. "The next 24 hours are critical. She needs fluids, antibiotics, pain management, and complete rest. But more than that, she needs to believe she's safe. Stress could kill her just as surely as her injuries." She began preparing medications, an antibiotic injection, a carefully calculated dose of pain relief that wouldn't pass too strongly into her milk and harm the cubs. Fluids administered subcutaneously, since intravenous would be too invasive and stressful. "Marcus," she called over her shoulder, "set up the portable shelter and get the heating lamps ready. We're not moving her tonight." too dangerous for her and the cubs. Marcus immediately went to work, pulling equipment from the Land Rover, a lightweight but sturdy tent structure designed for field veterinary work, battery-powered heating lamps, blankets, additional medical supplies. Daniel watched as Dr. Amare administered the medications with remarkable gentleness, speaking constantly to the Jaguar in that same soothing tone. The big cat flinched at the needle pricks but didn't fight, as if understanding on some instinctive level that this was necessary. "Daniel," Dr. Amare said as she worked, "I need you to tell me everything. How did a jaguar end up in the African savannah? This species doesn't exist here naturally. Where did she come from?" Daniel had been wondering the same thing. "I don't know. There are no zoos within 500 kilometers that house jaguars, no private reserves that I know of. She's wild. You can see it in how she moves, how she reacts. This isn't a captive animal that escaped recently." Dr. Amare frowned, examining the jaguar's coat more closely, looking for any signs of tags, tattoos, or identifying marks that might indicate human ownership. No identification, no signs of prolonged captivity. Her teeth are worn naturally, her claws are intact and used. If I didn't know better, I'd say she's been wild her entire life. "But that's impossible," Marcus called from where he was setting up the shelter. "Impossible or not, she's here," Daniel said firmly. "And right now, where she came from matters less than making sure she survives." Dr. Amare nodded. "Agreed. But Daniel, this complicates things. Once word gets out, and it will, we're going to have every conservation organization, zoo, and government agency demanding answers. A jaguar in Africa with cubs? This is unprecedented." She finished administering the fluids and sat back, observing the jaguar's breathing. It was already steadier, the medications beginning to take effect. The big cat's eyes were clearer now, more alert, and she pulled her cubs even closer, a gesture that was unmistakably protective. "For now, we focus on stabilization," Dr. Amare continued. "We'll move her into the shelter, keep her warm, monitor her through the night. The cubs need to nurse every 2 hours. If she's too weak or her milk doesn't come in properly, we'll need to supplement with formula, but I'd rather avoid that if possible. Mother's milk gives them the antibodies they need." The shelter was ready within 20 minutes, a remarkable feat given the circumstances. It was essentially a large, climate-controlled tent with mesh sides that allowed airflow while keeping insects and small predators out. Inside, Marcus had arranged thick blankets and heating lamps positioned to provide warmth without overheating. The challenge now was moving the jaguar. She was weak, but she was still a jaguar, powerful, unpredictable, and fiercely protective of her newborns. "We can't tranquilize her," Dr. Amar said, thinking aloud. "Not with the cubs nursing and her system already compromised. We need her cooperation." Daniel looked at the jaguar, at Amara. The name had stuck in his mind, feeling more right with every passing hour. "Let me try something." He moved slowly toward the shelter entrance, just a few meters from where the jaguar lay. Then he sat down, making himself small and non-threatening, and simply waited. He pulled out his water bottle and took a drink, then poured some into his palm and held it out toward her. Not approaching, just offering. The jaguar watched him intently. Her nose twitched, scenting the water, the shelter, the new environment. Daniel spoke softly. "I know you're tired. I know everything hurts and you don't understand what's happening. But that shelter is warm. It's safe. It's protected. Your cubs will be safer there. You can rest there." He slowly stood and walked into the shelter, then sat down inside it, still visible to the jaguar. He patted the blankets beside him gently. "It's okay. Come see." Dr. Amare and Marcus exchanged glances, clearly thinking Daniel had lost his mind. You didn't coax a wild jaguar like it was a house cat, but something extraordinary happened. The jaguar, with obvious effort and pain, began to drag herself forward, not away from the shelter, but toward it. She moved slowly, pausing frequently, but she kept coming. When she reached the entrance, she stopped and looked at Daniel for a long moment. He remained perfectly still. "That's it, Mama. You're so brave. Just a little further." She pulled herself inside, her cubs mewling in protest at the movement, still attached and nursing. Once inside, she collapsed onto the blankets with a sound that was half groan, half sigh. The heated air immediately began to warm her, and she stretched out slightly, easing the pressure on her injured ribs. Daniel carefully, slowly, backed out of the shelter, giving her space. The cubs resettled against her belly, and within moments, the whole family looked more comfortable than they had all night. Dr. Amare stared in disbelief. "In 15 years of wildlife veterinary work, I have never seen anything like that. She trusted you." Daniel was equally amazed. "I think she's just too tired to fight anymore." "No," Dr. Amare said firmly. "That was trust. Animals know. They can sense intention. She knows you saved her." They set up a watch schedule, one person monitoring the Jaguar at all times, the others resting in shifts. The hyenas had retreated but were still out there, voices occasionally echoing in the darkness. The fire was maintained, and the Land Rover's spotlight remained on, creating a circle of safety. As the night deepened, Daniel took the first watch. He sat outside the shelter, close enough to observe, but far enough to give the Jaguar privacy, and watched as she cleaned her cubs with slow, methodical strokes of her rough tongue. Despite her injuries, despite her exhaustion, she was devoted to them utterly. Dr. Amare approached quietly and sat beside him, handing him a thermos of hot coffee from the vehicle. "You should be proud," she said quietly. "You didn't just save her life. You saved 4 lives tonight." "I just did what anyone would do," Daniel replied, though they both knew that wasn't true. "No," Dr. Amare corrected gently. "You did what you were meant to do. This Jaguar, against all logic and possibility, ended up in your territory, on your patrol route, at the exact moment when someone with your particular combination of skills and compassion would be there to help. Some people would call that coincidence." "What would you call it?" Daniel asked. "Doctor." Amare smiled, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I'd call it destiny, and I'd say your real work is just beginning, because now we have to figure out what happens next." She was right. Dawn would bring new challenges. Questions about the Jaguar's origins, decisions about her future, the logistics of caring for a species that shouldn't exist on this continent. But for now, in this moment, 4 lives breathed peacefully in the shelter, safe and warm. And that, Daniel thought, was enough. Dawn broke over the savannah in shades of rose and gold, painting the landscape with soft light that made everything seem gentler, more forgiving. The night had been long and tense, punctuated by the sounds of prowling predators and the occasional distressed mewling of the cubs. But they had made it through. Daniel had dozed fitfully during Marcus's watch shift, waking every time his radio crackled or when he heard movement near the shelter. Now, as the sun climbed higher, he stood and stretched, his body aching from tension and the awkward positions he'd held throughout the night. His eyes felt gritty with exhaustion, but there was no time to rest properly. Inside the shelter, the Jaguar, Amara, as Daniel had begun thinking of her exclusively now, was awake and alert. Her amber eyes tracked every movement outside the mesh walls. The cubs were nursing again, their tiny bodies pressed against her warmth, their small sounds of contentment the most hopeful thing Daniel had heard in hours. Dr. Amar emerged from the Land Rover where she'd been catching a brief nap, looking remarkably composed despite the circumstances. She carried her medical kit and a tablet computer, already shifting into the methodical mindset of morning assessments. "How is she?" Dr. Amare asked, approaching the shelter carefully. "Restless," Daniel reported. "She's been watching the perimeter constantly. Every sound makes her tense, but the cubs seem strong. They've been nursing regularly." Dr. Amare nodded, making notes on her tablet. "That's good. The more they nurse, the better their chances. But we need to examine her wounds in daylight, check for any deterioration overnight." The examination was tense. Amara tolerated, Doctor. Amari's presence only because Daniel sat nearby, speaking softly, his voice a constant thread of reassurance. The doctor worked quickly, checking the Jaguar's vital signs, examining the areas where the python's coils had compressed her body, looking for signs of internal bleeding or organ damage. Her breathing is better, Dr. Amar said after several minutes. Heart rate is still elevated but improving. The ribs are definitely cracked. I can feel the displacement here and here, but there's no sign of punctured lungs, which is our biggest concern with this type of injury. She sat back, frowning thoughtfully. She's incredibly resilient. Any other animal with these injuries, after giving birth, I would have expected complications by now. But she's fighting. She wants to survive. For them, Daniel said, gesturing to the cubs. She's surviving for them. Maternal instinct is powerful, Doctor. Amari agreed. But Daniel, we need to talk about what happens next. We can't keep her in a field shelter indefinitely. She needs proper veterinary facilities, a controlled environment where we can monitor her recovery and ensure the cubs thrive. Daniel had been dreading this conversation. You want to move her to the reserve clinic. It's the only logical option. We have the facilities, the equipment, the staff to provide 24-hour care. She'll never survive captivity, Daniel said firmly. Look at her, she's wild, completely wild. Being confined, surrounded by humans, the stress alone could kill her. And staying out here could kill her too, Dr. Amare countered, not unkindly. Daniel, I understand your connection to her. What you did last night was extraordinary. But we have to think about what's best for her long-term survival and the survival of those cubs. Before Daniel could respond, Marcus's voice cut through the morning air, sharp with alarm. We've got company. 3 vehicles approaching from the east. They turned to see a convoy of land cruisers kicking up dust along the access road, moving fast. Too fast for a casual patrol. As the vehicles drew closer, Daniel could make out official markings, Kenya Wildlife Service, and another he didn't immediately recognize. That was fast, Dr. Amare muttered. I only filed the preliminary report 2 hours ago. The vehicles pulled up in a semicircle around the camp, and a small group of officials emerged. The lead figure was a tall man in his 50s, wearing the uniform of a senior KWS officer, his posture radiating authority. Behind him came 2 other rangers, a woman in civilian clothes carrying camera equipment, and another man in a suit that looked absurdly out of place in the bush. Dr. Amare, the senior officer said, his voice clipped and professional. I'm Chief Warden Kimathi. I received your report about a Jaguar. I need to see it immediately. Good morning to you too, Chief Warden, Dr. Amare replied coolly. The animal is in the shelter, but she's been through severe trauma. I need to ask you to approach slowly and quietly. She's protecting newborns, and she's extremely stressed. Kimathi's expression suggested he didn't appreciate being told how to approach wildlife, but he nodded curtly. The group moved toward the shelter, and Daniel positioned himself protectively near the entrance. When Kimathi saw Amara, his reaction was immediate and visceral. His eyes widened, his hand moving unconsciously to his chest, as if to steady himself. My God, he breathed. It's true. It's actually true. The woman with the camera immediately began taking photos, the click and whir of the shutter causing Amara to flatten her ears and emit a low, warning growl. Daniel stepped in front of the lens. No photographs, he said firmly. Not without proper distance and consideration for her condition. The woman looked to Kimathi, who hesitated, then nodded. Agreed. Put the camera away for now, Chen. The man in the suit stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that made Daniel immediately wary. Remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. Do we have any theory about how she arrived here? Not yet, Mr. Dr. Amare prompted. Peterson. Johann Peterson. I'm a representative of the International Exotic Species Recovery Program. We track displaced and endangered animals across continents. He pulled out a tablet, already pulling up files. There have been no reports of escaped or missing jaguars from any registered facilities in Africa, Europe, or Asia. which means either she came from an unregistered private collection or what? Daniel asked. Peterson's expression was troubled. Or she's been wild for longer than we think. There have been rumors, unconfirmed, mostly dismissed as fantasy, of a small population of jaguars that were introduced to East Africa decades ago by an eccentric conservationist. It was supposedly an unauthorized rewilding attempt that failed. All animals were presumed dead within 2 years. That was 40 years ago, Kimathi said. No jaguar lives that long. No, Peterson agreed, but their offspring might. If even one breeding pair survived, if they adapted, learned to hunt the local prey. He trailed off, looking at Amara with something approaching wonder. We could be looking at a 4th or 5th generation African-born jaguar. The implications hung heavy in the air. If true, this wasn't just a displaced animal. This was a population, however small, that had been surviving undetected for decades. We need to capture her, Kimathi said decisively. Transport her to Nairobi for proper examination, genetic testing, health screening. This is too important to leave to field medicine. No offense, Dr. Amare. Capture? Daniel's voice was sharp. She's barely stable. Moving her now, the stress of transport, of captivity, it could kill her. Ranger Okoro makes a valid point, Dr. Amare interjected. Her injuries are severe. I'm not certain she would survive a tranquilization and transport at this stage. Then we'll wait, Kimathi said. 24 hours, 48 if necessary. But she needs to be in a secure facility where we can protect her and study her properly. If there are more jaguars out there, we need to understand their genetics, their health, their viability as a population. She's not a specimen, Daniel said, his voice low and intense. She's a mother with 3 newborn cubs. What she needs is safety, quiet, and time to heal. Peterson moved closer to the shelter, his eyes scanning Amara with clinical precision. The cubs are how old? Less than 12 hours, Dr. Amare answered. They can't be transported for at least 2 weeks, Peterson said, minimum. Before that, the stress would likely be fatal, which means we have a window. Chief Warden, I recommend we establish a permanent monitoring presence here. Keep the mother and cubs under observation in their current location until they're strong enough for transport. Kimathi didn't look happy, but he nodded. Agreed. We'll set up a proper camp, rotate staff, maintain security. Doctor, Amare, you'll remain as primary veterinarian. Of course. Good. Ranger Okoro, I understand you were the one who found her and managed the initial rescue? Daniel nodded warily. Then you'll be assigned as primary handler and liaison. No one else will approach the animal without your presence and approval. She seems to have bonded with you, and that's an asset we can't ignore. It wasn't a request. It was an order. But Daniel found he didn't mind. If staying meant he could ensure Amara and her cubs were treated with respect and care, he'd accept any assignment they threw at him. The rest of the morning was a flurry of activity. More personnel arrived, additional rangers, support staff, equipment for a semi-permanent camp. A perimeter was established, keeping curious onlookers and potential threats at a safe distance. Satellite phones were distributed, communication protocols established, supply lines arranged. Through it all, Daniel remained near the shelter, a constant presence that seemed to ease Amara's anxiety. She watched the chaos with wary eyes, but as long as Daniel was nearby, she remained calm, focused on her cubs. By midday, the camp resembled a small village. Tents, equipment, vehicles, personnel, all orbiting around one injured jaguar and her 3 tiny cubs. It was surreal, overwhelming, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that Amara had become a prisoner rather than a patient. Doctor, Amare seemed to sense his thoughts. She found him sitting outside the shelter during a rare, quiet moment, brought him food he barely touched, and sat beside him in companionable silence. This isn't what you wanted, she said finally. No, Daniel admitted. I wanted her to heal, to raise her cubs in peace, to disappear back into whatever hidden territory she came from. I wanted her to be free. She might still get that chance, Dr. Amar said gently. If she recovers, if the cubs survive and thrive, if the genetic tests come back showing a viable population, Daniel, this could be the beginning of something extraordinary. A species adapting to a new continent, succeeding against all odds. That's worth protecting, worth studying. And if the tests show she's alone, the last of her line. Dr. Amare was quiet for a long moment. Then we make sure her cubs survive. We make sure her sacrifice, coming here, enduring everything she's endured, wasn't for nothing. That afternoon, as the heat reached its peak and most of the camp sought shade, something changed in the shelter. Amara's breathing became labored again, her body tense with pain that the medications couldn't fully suppress. One of the cubs, the smallest female, had stopped nursing and lay listless and cold despite the warming lamps. "Doctor." Amare was inside the shelter immediately, Daniel right behind her. She examined the cub with gentle, efficient hands, her expression growing more concerned with each passing second. "She's hypothermic and hypoglycemic," Dr. Amare said quietly. "She's not getting enough milk. The mother's stress and injuries, her milk production is dropping." "What can we do?" Daniel asked, though he dreaded the answer. "I can try supplemental feeding, but she's so small, so weak. At this age, every hour matters." Dr. Amare pulled out a tiny bottle, specially designed for newborn big cats, and began mixing formula with practiced efficiency. But the cub wouldn't latch onto the bottle. Her tiny mouth opened and closed weakly, but she lacked the strength to suckle. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity, as Dr. Amare tried every technique she knew. Amara watched with increasingly frantic eyes, licking her failing cub desperately, trying to stimulate her, to will life back into her tiny body. The mother's distress was palpable, heartbreaking, and there was nothing Daniel could do but witness it. "Daniel," Dr. Amare said softly, "I need you to hold her. Skin-to-skin contact, warmth. It might help." Without hesitation, Daniel carefully lifted the tiny cub. She was so small she fit in one palm, her fur still damp and dark, her eyes sealed shut. He tucked her against his chest, inside his shirt, letting his body heat envelop her. He could feel her heart beating, rapid and faint like a hummingbird's. "Come on, little one," he whispered. "You're a fighter. Your mama's a fighter. You've got her strength in you. Come on." He thought of his sister Amara, of the moment he'd held her lifeless body, unable to bring her back. He thought of all the times in his life when he'd felt powerless, when death had taken what he loved despite his best efforts. But this time felt different. This time, the cub's heart was still beating. He held her for 20 minutes, speaking softly, rocking gently, willing his own life force into her tiny body. Dr. Amare worked alongside him, administering minute amounts of glucose solution with a syringe, massaging the cub's chest to stimulate circulation. And slowly, impossibly, color began to return to the cub's gums. Her breathing strengthened. Her tiny body grew warmer. "She's responding," Dr. Amare said, wonder in her voice. "Daniel, she's coming back." They tried the bottle again, and this time the cub latched on. Weakly at first, then with growing vigor, she began to drink. The relief that flooded through Daniel was so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. He carefully returned the cub to her mother, and Amara immediately gathered her close, cleaning her, encouraging her to nurse alongside her siblings. The cub nuzzled against her mother's belly and began to feed naturally, her crisis seemingly past. "Doctor." Amare sat back, her hands shaking slightly. That was close, too close. Daniel looked at her, then at Amara and her 3 cubs, all alive, all fighting. "But we didn't lose her." "No," Dr. Amare agreed. "We didn't." Outside the shelter, the camp continued its busy rhythm. Officials made plans, scientists discussed genetic testing, rangers maintained security. But inside the shelter, in that small space warmed by heating lamps and hope, a family rested together. A mother and her 3 cubs, saved by the intervention of strangers who had become guardians. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Daniel allowed himself a moment to breathe, to feel the weight of everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. He had saved a life, 4 lives, and in doing so, he had honored the memory of the sister he couldn't save, had fulfilled the promise his grandmother had made him make all those years ago, to be present, to help when help was needed, to stand between life and death and choose life, always life. 6 months passed like water flowing through the savannah, sometimes rushing, sometimes still, but always moving forward. The rainy season came and transformed the landscape into something lush and green, the dried riverbeds filling with fresh water, the acacia trees bursting with new leaves. Life exploded across the savannah in ways that made Daniel remember why he loved this work, why he had chosen to dedicate his life to protecting these wild places and the creatures that called them home. The camp had been dismantled within a week of Amara's departure, but the area had been officially designated as protected habitat. New regulations were put in place, limiting human access, establishing wildlife corridors, creating safe zones. Chief Warden Kimathi, to his credit, had fought hard for the designation, eventually winning approval from the ministry after presenting the genetic evidence and the potential conservation significance. Daniel had returned to his regular duties, but he was different now. Everyone could see it. There was a quiet confidence about him that hadn't been there before, a sense of purpose that ran deeper than routine patrols and camera trap maintenance. He had touched something profound in those days with Amara, had participated in a moment that transcended the ordinary boundaries between human and animal, and it had changed him fundamentally. Dr. Amare had become a regular visitor to the reserve, consulting on various cases, but always making time to check the remote cameras with Daniel, to review the footage, to look for any sign of their Jaguar family. They had become friends. Good friends, bonded by the shared experience of those intense days and nights. The camera network had been expanded significantly, covering a much wider area now. Peterson's organization had funded the expansion, desperate to document what they now called the African Jaguar population. It was a grandiose name for what was likely just a handful of individuals. But Daniel understood the excitement. This was unprecedented, remarkable, and worth studying. And slowly, gradually, the cameras began to tell a story. Amara appeared on footage regularly now, not frequently, but often enough to establish a pattern. She had claimed a territory along the western edge of the reserve, an area thick with riverine forest and rocky outcrops that provided perfect denning sites. The cameras captured her hunting, dragging kills up into trees in classic Jaguar fashion, moving through her territory with the confidence of an apex predator that had nothing to fear. The cubs appeared in the footage too, growing larger with each sighting. By 3 months they were half their mother's size, their spots fully developed, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They practiced hunting on each other, on shadows, on small prey their mother brought them. Amara was teaching them, showing them how to be jaguars, passing down knowledge that had somehow survived 4 decades in a foreign land. Jabari, the largest male, was bold and adventurous, often ranging ahead of his siblings, investigating everything. Kazi, the smallest female who had nearly died, was cautious but determined, watching everything carefully before acting. And Amani, the firstborn, moved with a grace and stillness that reminded Daniel achingly of her mother. They were thriving, but Amara was not alone. In the 4th month after her disappearance, a camera captured something that made Daniel's heart nearly stop. Amara with another adult jaguar, a male, larger and darker than her. The 2 animals circled each other in the footage, tense at first, then gradually relaxing. It wasn't mating behavior. Not yet. The cubs were too young, and Amara wouldn't be receptive again for months. But it was contact, communication, evidence that there were indeed others. Peterson had flown in immediately when he saw the footage, his excitement barely contained. "This changes everything," he had said, replaying the video for the dozenth time. "A male in the same territory. That means at least 2 breeding adults, possibly more. Daniel, we might actually have a viable population here." Over the following weeks, 2 more individuals were documented. Another female, younger than Amara, and what appeared to be a juvenile male. 5 jaguars, possibly 6 if Amara's mate from before the python attack had survived. It was a tiny population, precarious and vulnerable, but it was a population nonetheless. The conservation world took notice. Papers were published, documentaries were filmed, funding poured in. The area around the reserve became an international focal point for discussions about unintentional rewilding, about species adaptation, about the resilience of nature when given even the smallest chance to survive. But for Daniel, it was never about the scientific significance or the conservation implications. It was about 4 lives he had helped save on a desperate night by a dried riverbed. It was about honoring a promise he had made to a dying sister 20 years ago. It was about being present when presence mattered most. On the anniversary of the night he found Amara, Daniel requested a day off and returned to the spot by the old riverbed. The rains had transformed it. Water flowed freely now, clear and cold, and the fig tree's leaves rustled with birdsong. The place where he had built the fire, where the shelter had stood, was covered in new grass, all evidence of that night erased by time and weather. But Daniel remembered every detail: the crushing coils of the python, the desperate wheeze of the jaguar struggling for breath, the tiny, impossibly fragile cubs, the long night of watching and waiting and hoping. He sat by the water's edge, just as Amara had that evening, and poured out a small offering, water from the same bottle he had used to give her those first few drops that had kept her alive. It was a ritual his grandmother had taught him, a way of honoring the sacred moments of life, of acknowledging the connections that bind all living things together. "Thank you," he said quietly, to the memory of that night, to the spirit of the place, to whatever force had brought him and Amara together at exactly the right moment. "Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for surviving." A sound made him turn, and his breath caught. There, on the opposite bank, partially hidden in the reeds but unmistakable, was Amara. She stood perfectly still, watching him with those amber eyes that had haunted his dreams for months. She was magnificent, fully healed, powerfully built, radiating the kind of lethal grace that defined her species. Behind her, barely visible, were 3 young jaguars, nearly as large as their mother now, their eyes fixed on Daniel with curiosity and wariness. For a long moment, human and jaguar regarded each other across the water. Daniel made no move, barely breathed, afraid that any action would break the spell of this moment. Then Amara did something extraordinary. She sat down, her posture relaxed, and simply looked at him, not with fear or aggression, but with what Daniel could only interpret as recognition. She remembered him. She knew him. And in her own way, in the only way she could, she was acknowledging what had passed between them. The cubs watched their mother, learning from her lack of fear, and gradually they too settled, still alert, but no longer tense. They stayed like that for 5 minutes, maybe 10. Daniel lost track of time. It was a conversation without words, a communion of spirits that transcended the vast differences between their species. In that moment, Daniel understood what his grandmother had tried to teach him all those years ago, that compassion was the bridge that connected all living things, that when we acted from love rather than fear, we created possibilities that logic alone could never predict. Eventually Amara stood, gave him one last long look, and turned away. The cubs followed, disappearing into the vegetation with the fluid grace of predators born to this land. Within seconds, they were gone, as if they had never been there at all. Daniel sat by the water for a long time after that, feeling the weight and the lightness of the moment simultaneously. He had been given a gift, the knowledge that his intervention had mattered, that those 4 lives he had fought so hard to save were flourishing, were free, were exactly what they were meant to be. When he finally stood to leave, he noticed something on his side of the bank. Fresh tracks in the mud, large paw prints that hadn't been there when he arrived. Amara had crossed the water at some point, had come close enough to leave her mark, then returned to her family. It was a message as clear as any words could have been. I was here. I remember. Thank you. Daniel photographed the tracks, not for scientific documentation or proof, but for himself, to remember this moment when nature had chosen to reveal itself to him in a way that was both humbling and honoring. As he walked back toward the reserve headquarters, the sun setting behind him in a blaze of color, Daniel thought about the journey that had brought him here. The loss of his sister, the years of searching for meaning, the grandmother who had shown him that healing came through service, through being present for others in their moments of need. He thought about Amara, about her fierce will to survive, her devotion to her cubs, her trust in a strange creature that should have been her enemy but had chosen instead to be her ally. And he thought about the future, about those 3 cubs growing strong and wild, about the other jaguars hidden in the savannah, about the generations that might come if this tiny population could hold on just a little longer, could adapt just a little more, could find their place in this land that was both foreign and somehow home. Dr. Amare was waiting at the headquarters when he returned, a knowing smile on her face. "You saw her, didn't you?" Daniel nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. "I'm glad," Dr. Amare said simply. "You needed that closure. You both did." But it wasn't closure, Daniel realized. It was a beginning. The beginning of a new chapter in both their stories. His as a guardian who had learned that sometimes the greatest help we can give is to step back and trust in the resilience of life itself. And hers as a mother who had survived impossible odds and was now passing that strength onto the next generation. The savannah stretched endlessly in all directions, vast and ancient and full of secrets. Somewhere out there, a jaguar family moved through the gathering darkness, hunting and learning and living. They were survivors, adapters, proof that life would always find a way when given even the smallest chance. And Daniel, walking toward the lights of the compound, carrying the memory of amber eyes and trust given across impossible divides, knew that he would spend the rest of his life protecting that chance, honoring that trust, and being present for whatever miracles the wild chose to reveal. Some stories end. This one, he understood, was just beginning. The stars emerged overhead, brilliant and countless, the same stars that had witnessed that desperate night 6 months ago, the same stars that would continue to witness all the nights to come. Under their light, the savannah breathed with life, predator and prey, struggle and grace, death and birth endlessly cycling in the ancient dance of existence. And in the midst of it all, 4 jaguars who shouldn't exist but did, who had been saved by compassion and now thrived through courage, moved like shadows through their adopted homeland, free, wild, alive, exactly as they were meant to be. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and if you've ever witnessed or lived something like this.